Number 10. The Ningen. Some sea legends feel ancient because they were carried by myth, but others feel more disturbing because they seem to have surfaced inside the modern world and refuse to behave like ordinary folklore. The Ningen belongs to that darker category of ocean mystery. Described in modern rumor as a huge, pale, humanoid shape seen in Antarctic waters, the creature became famous not because it came from old scripture or medieval bestiaries, but because it seemed to emerge from a place already suited to modern fear. The freezing emptiness of the polar sea, where distance, ice, and isolation make almost anything seem possible. In descriptions of the Ningen, the creature is said to have an almost human outline, but swollen to a size and scale that turns familiarity into horror. That is what makes the idea so effective. It is not simply a beast. It is something uncomfortably close to the human form, expanded into something cold, silent, and completely at home in water where human life can barely survive. That setting is essential to the legend's power. The Antarctic already feels like the edge of the known world, a region of white emptiness, black water, drifting ice, and severe silence where the imagination easily begins to populate the horizon with things too strange for warmer seas. A whale can breach and vanish. A ridge of ice can resemble a body. A pale form in dark water can become a nightmare before the mind has finished identifying it. But the Ningen survived precisely because it went beyond ordinary marine misidentification and entered a more primal zone of discomfort. People were not just imagining a large animal. They were imagining a giant, almost person-shaped thing moving through the ocean where no human being could endure for more than moments without technology and protection. The result was less like zoology and more like a modern abyssal myth. Skeptical explanations naturally followed. Some argued that the reports likely grew from sightings of whales, ice formations, distorted perspectives, or internet-age embellishment amplified by mystery culture. That is entirely plausible, and the Ningen may well owe much of its survival to the speed with which strange images and dramatic retellings can spread through modern media. But rational explanation does not fully erase the emotional structure of the legend. The Ningen remains haunting because it combines three powerful fears in one form: the fear of deep water, the fear of extreme remoteness, and the fear of encountering something that looks just human enough to feel wrong. In older eras, the sea often produced creatures that were monstrous because they were radically non-human. The Ningen disturbs because it seems to blur categories that should remain separate. What keeps the legend alive is not hard proof that such a being exists, but the way it fits the psychological landscape of the ocean's coldest reaches. The sea is already terrifying when it hides sharks, squids, and unseen depth. It becomes more unsettling when the imagination begins to place shapes within it that reflect us back in altered form. The Ningen survives because it feels like the kind of thing that should not exist, yet belongs too perfectly to the most hostile waters on Earth to be dismissed without residue. Whether it is a creature, a distortion, or an internet-born modern myth, it reveals something important about the ocean. Even now, the sea remains one of the last places where a legend can still feel as though it might be waiting under the surface. Number 9. The Nahuelito Lake Monster. Some legends endure because they belong to the open sea, where scale itself makes almost anything imaginable. Others become powerful because they attach themselves to inland waters that should feel smaller, calmer, and more knowable, yet somehow do not. The Nahuelito Lake Monster belongs to that second kind of unease. Said to inhabit Lake Nahuel Huapi in Argentina, Nahuelito has often been compared to other famous lake creatures. But the legend carries its own atmosphere, shaped by dark water, mountainous isolation, and repeated stories of something large moving beneath the surface. That is what gives the case its force. A lake should, in theory, feel more limited than the ocean. It should feel easier to map, easier to search, easier to reduce to natural explanation. But when a monster legend survives in such a place, it suggests not endlessness, but concealment. as if even a contained body of water can preserve something ancient, elusive, and only half seen. The landscape surrounding the legend matters deeply. Nahuelito is not just any lake. It sits amid a dramatic region of mountains, forests, cold waters, and changing light. The kind of environment where reflections distort, distance deceives, and a single disturbance on the surface can take on enormous narrative power. In such settings, the imagination does not need much. A long dark shape, an unexpected wake, a glimpse of a neck-like form, and the lake begins to feel less like scenery and more like a hidden chamber. Stories such as Nahuelito survive not because they provide constant evidence, but because the setting itself cooperates with mystery. The water becomes a screen onto which fear and possibility can be projected again and again without ever being fully exhausted. Over the years, sightings and stories helped keep the legend alive, while skeptics pointed to more familiar explanations such as large fish, floating logs, wave distortion, exaggeration, or the influence of older monster traditions on how witnesses interpret what they see. Those explanations are reasonable, and many lake monster stories almost certainly feed on a cycle in which expectation shapes perception and perception renews legend. But what makes Nahuelito interesting is not whether every sighting withstands scrutiny. It is that the legend has persisted at all in a modern world increasingly defined by surveys, photography, and scientific confidence. A creature does not need to be proven to matter culturally. Sometimes the endurance of the belief itself reveals how strongly certain landscapes invite the return of old fears. What keeps Nahuelito alive is the way the legend transforms a lake into a threshold. The water stops being only water and becomes a surface beneath which memory, rumor, and fear remain suspended. That is why lake monsters are often so enduring. They do not require the infinite scale of the ocean. They require stillness, depth, and the possibility that something may rise only briefly enough to be seen and never long enough to be settled. Nahuelito remains haunting for precisely that reason. It is not simply a South American echo of other famous monster traditions. It is one more reminder that when water is dark enough and the shoreline remote enough, the human mind still has no difficulty believing that something ancient may be moving just below the surface. Number 8. The Bloop. Some deep-water legends begin as stories told by sailors, but others begin as data, and that is what makes them so unsettling. The Bloop entered modern mystery not as a beast seen rising from the sea, but as a sound recorded in 1997 by underwater listening equipment in the South Pacific, a powerful, ultra-low frequency noise so immense in character that it immediately invited speculation about something vast and alive moving in the deep. That is what gave the case such immediate force. It was not born from folklore, drunken exaggeration, or a half-seen silhouette between waves. It came from instruments, from the cold language of acoustic monitoring, from technology designed to hear what human beings cannot hear directly. And when the modern world listens to the ocean with machines and still finds something strange enough to inspire monster theories, the result feels far darker than an old maritime tale. The ocean is especially suited to this kind of fear because sound travels through it in ways that make distance and source extremely difficult to grasp. A noise can be enormous without being near, biological without being understood, or mechanical without being recognized. That uncertainty matters because the Bloop did not sound merely unusual. It sounded grand in scale, as if it belonged to something large enough to make the mind reach for hidden organisms, colossal predators, or surviving forms of life from a more ancient world. The deep sea already feels less like an ecosystem fully known than a buried layer of the planet, where old evolutionary possibilities might still linger beyond ordinary witness. Once a sound like that emerges from such a place, the imagination hardly needs encouragement. It begins building a creature around the noise almost immediately. Eventually, scientific interpretation moved toward a more natural explanation, linking the Bloop to ice activity, likely the sound of large icequakes or fracturing ice in remote polar environments. On paper, that answer is compelling, and for many it resolves the mystery. but even resolved mysteries can leave behind powerful residue. The Bloop remains haunting because it briefly exposed how quickly modern certainty collapses when the deep ocean produces evidence that feels too large for comfort. The explanation may be natural, but the emotional effect came first, and the effect was simple. For a moment, the world seemed to have heard something alive in the abyss that it could not immediately name. What keeps the Bloop alive in ocean mystery culture is not just the sound itself, but what it revealed about the human relationship with the deep. We have mapped coastlines, crossed oceans, and built instruments to listen beneath thousands of meters of water. Yet one strange acoustic event was enough to reawaken the old fear that the sea may still contain presences beyond our scale of expectation. Even if the source was ice and not flesh, the case remains powerful because it came from the one realm where a monster does not even need to be seen. In the deep ocean, it is enough for something to be heard once in the dark, at impossible distance, with a force that feels far too large to belong to an empty world. Number 7. The giant squid legends. Some sea monsters endured because they were exaggerated. Others endured because they turned out to be real. That is what makes the giant squid legends so extraordinary. For centuries, sailors described enormous tentacled beings rising from the deep, creatures capable of wrapping ships, dragging men into the sea, or appearing as monstrous glimpses of a world beneath the surface that no one could fully verify. These stories were often folded into larger myths of ocean terror, feeding the image of the Kraken and other colossal horrors of the abyss. In many intellectual circles, they were dismissed as exaggeration, myth-making, or the distorted memory of frightened men at sea. But the deeper truth was more unsettling. There really were giant squids in the world, and humanity simply spent a long time knowing them mostly through fragments, carcasses, and stories that hovered between zoology and nightmare. That borderland is exactly what gave the legend its staying power. The giant squid was not merely a fantasy, but neither was it comfortably known. For much of history, it existed in a disturbing middle ground where enough evidence appeared to prevent dismissal, yet not enough direct observation existed to make the creature feel ordinary. Dead specimens washed ashore. Whales were found bearing enormous sucker scars. Strange remains surfaced in places too remote and too violent for easy study. The result was a creature that belonged at once to science and to fear. It was real, but its way of being real remained hidden in the deep, in darkness, in depths where the human body cannot survive and the human eye cannot watch unaided. The modern age eventually changed that relationship by capturing images of giant squids in ways earlier centuries could only dream of. But even then, the creature did not lose its unsettling power. Seeing a giant squid documented did not make it feel tame. If anything, it confirmed that the old maritime imagination had not been foolish to fear tentacled enormity in the deep. This is part of what makes sea monster legends so fascinating. Sometimes a myth does not die because it is false. Sometimes it survives because reality turns out to be strange enough to justify it, though not always in the exact form the stories claimed. What keeps the giant squid legend alive is the sense that it reveals a humiliating truth about the ocean. Human beings long treated the sea as a space they crossed, exploited, and named. Yet beneath that surface lived one of the most bizarre, large animals on Earth, elusive enough to remain half legendary for generations. The giant squid reminds us that the deep is not frightening only because it may hide imaginary beasts. It is frightening because it has already hidden real ones large enough, alien enough, and unreachable enough to sustain centuries of terror. In that sense, the giant squid is one of the most powerful ocean legends of all, because it teaches the darkest lesson a sea monster story can offer. Sometimes the thing sailors feared is not less real than the myth. It is more real, and perhaps stranger. Number 6. The St. Augustine monster. Some sea legends refuse to die because they are supported by eyewitness stories, but others survive because something physical seemed to wash out of the unknown and into human hands. The St. Augustine monster became famous for exactly that reason. In 1896, a huge mass of strange flesh was found on a beach near St. Augustine, Florida, and almost immediately it triggered one of the oldest and most unsettling ocean questions of all. What kind of thing could produce remains like that? It did not look like the tidy body of a familiar marine animal. It looked amorphous, oversized, and difficult to classify, the kind of object that invites the imagination to move faster than science can comfortably follow. That is what gave the case its dark power. When the sea gives back something incomplete, it often feels more frightening than if it had given back a whole creature, because absence lets fear fill in the missing anatomy. The timing of the discovery mattered as well. This was an era when the ocean still felt vastly less known than it does even now, and public fascination with enormous hidden sea life was already shaped by stories of giant squids, serpents, and abyssal monsters. A massive lump of unidentified tissue arriving from the surf seemed to offer exactly the sort of evidence that deep-water nightmares had always promised but rarely delivered. The problem, of course, was that evidence without clarity can be more destabilizing than no evidence at all. If the remains had been instantly identifiable, the mystery would have ended almost as soon as it began. Instead, the object hovered in that uncomfortable zone where scientists, journalists, and the public could all look at the same thing and see different possibilities unfolding from it. Over time, more cautious interpretations pushed the case toward a natural explanation, with many later analyses suggesting that the so-called monster was likely the decomposed remains of a whale, perhaps stripped down into collagen-rich tissue that created a bizarre and misleading appearance. That explanation is strong, and from a scientific perspective, it likely brings the case much closer to Earth than the older monster theories ever did. But what keeps the St. Augustine monster haunting is not the likelihood that it was a whale. It is the lesson the case leaves behind. Even the remains of an ordinary marine giant can become almost unrecognizable after the sea has altered them. Decomposition, scavenging, salt, surf, and time can reshape a body into something that appears to belong to an entirely different world. That is why the case still matters in ocean mystery culture. It reveals how easily the sea can produce physical evidence that feels monstrous, even when nature is ultimately responsible. A carcass does not need to come from an unknown species to deepen fear of the unknown. It only needs to emerge in a form strange enough to remind us how little the shoreline tells us about the depths that fed it. The St. Augustine monster survived because it briefly seemed to drag the body of a legend onto land, and even if science brought the answer closer to whale than monster, the deeper emotional truth remained untouched. The ocean is capable of returning pieces of itself in forms so altered and so disturbing that for a moment, humanity truly believes it has found proof that something colossal and nameless has died below the waves. Number 5. The Cadborosaurus. Some sea monsters belong so fully to myth that they feel almost timeless, but others become enduring because they linger in the uncomfortable territory between folklore, eyewitness testimony, and regional identity. The Cadborosaurus, often called Caddy, belongs to that second category. Reported mainly along the coasts of British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, the creature has been described as a long, serpentine marine animal with a horse-like head, humps, coils, or an eel-like body moving through coastal waters. That combination of features gave it immediate strength as a legend because it echoed older sea serpent traditions while attaching itself to a real modern coastline filled with fishermen, mariners, and communities accustomed to reading the ocean closely. When such people repeatedly claim to have seen something unnatural in familiar waters, the mystery gains a kind of grounded persistence that pure fantasy often lacks. The Pacific Northwest is almost too perfect a setting for such a creature. The region's cold waters, mist, island channels, forests, and grey horizons already create an atmosphere of layered concealment, where distance shifts quickly and the sea feels less open than watchful. In such a place, a long, moving shape can carry extraordinary force. A line of humps across the water, a head breaking the surface, an elongated body vanishing between waves. These are exactly the kinds of glimpses that create legends strong enough to survive for generations. The Cadborosaurus endures not because people have continuously produced decisive proof, but because the environment itself seems built to preserve ambiguity. Every unclear sighting becomes one more thread woven into a larger coastal memory. As with most sea serpent cases, skepticism has always been close behind. Misidentified marine mammals, unusual wave patterns, debris, groups of animals seen in sequence, and the tendency of expectation to shape interpretation all offer reasonable explanations for many reports. There have also been alleged carcass claims linked to the legend, though none delivered the kind of definitive zoological confirmation that would force the scientific world to accept a new large marine species. But legends do not need scientific victory in order to survive. In some ways, they become even stronger when evidence remains tantalizing but incomplete, because that incompleteness allows witnesses, skeptics, and believers to keep returning to the same body of stories without exhausting it. What keeps the Cadborosaurus alive is that it feels local and ancient at the same time. It is not merely a borrowed European sea serpent dropped into another coastline. It became part of the emotional geography of its own waters, a creature woven into the fog, the channels, and the coastal imagination of the North Pacific. That makes it more than just another monster report. It becomes a symbol of the sea's refusal to become fully ordinary, even in regions long mapped, sailed, and studied. The Cadborosaurus survives because it offers a version of the old ocean fear in modern form, the fear that something long, intelligent, and almost prehistoric may still be moving just beyond the range of certainty in waters human beings cross often but never completely master. Number 4. The Serpent of Gloucester Harbour. Some sea monster legends become powerful because they are ancient, while others become powerful because they emerged in times and places that should have made them easier to dismiss. The Serpent of Gloucester Harbour gained much of its force from that exact tension. In the early 19th century, along the Massachusetts coast, multiple witnesses reported seeing an enormous serpent-like creature moving through the water near Gloucester Harbour, and the accounts spread with unusual intensity because they came not from one isolated imagination, but from many observers describing something long, unnatural, and disturbingly animate in a region deeply tied to maritime life. This was not a tale drifting in from some distant, unknown sea. It seemed to belong to waters close to home, waters worked, watched, and crossed by people who believed they knew what ordinary marine life looked like. That sense of local credibility mattered. Sea legends become harder to dismiss when they arise in communities built around the ocean, because sailors and fishermen are not expected to be easily confused by every ripple or passing animal. The reported serpent was described as long and undulating, with a body that seemed too extended, too strange, and too dramatic to fit comfortably within the known fauna of the coast. Whether those descriptions were accurate, exaggerated, or shaped by the contagious power of rumour, they revealed something important about the psychology of sea terror. A monster does not need to inhabit the remotest abyss to become unforgettable. It is enough for it to appear near familiar shores and turn ordinary water into something newly unstable. As always, natural explanations remain entirely possible. Misidentified marine animals, unusual groupings of known creatures, wave effects, distance distortion, and the amplifying force of public excitement can all generate a pattern of reports that begins to feel stronger than any individual sighting might justify. Once a community starts looking for a sea serpent, the threshold for seeing one can fall dramatically. But that does not erase the historical power of the case. In fact, part of what makes the Gloucester serpent so enduring is that it sits exactly at the point where collective observation and collective imagination become difficult to separate. It becomes less a question of whether one creature truly passed through the harbour and more a question of why so many people found the image persuasive enough to keep it alive. What keeps the Serpent of Gloucester Harbour haunting is that it transformed a known coastline into a stage for the old ocean fear in one of its purest forms. The water did not need to open into abyssal darkness. It only needed to produce a shape long enough, deliberate enough, and strange enough to make witnesses feel that something from older maritime nightmares had entered their world without warning. The legend survives because it reminds us that sea monsters do not depend only on remoteness. Sometimes they thrive best where familiarity is strongest, because that is where their intrusion feels most real. A harbour is supposed to represent return, safety, and recognition. Once a serpent enters that space, even calm water begins to feel uncertain. Number 3. The Lusca of the Blue Holes. Some ocean legends are terrifying because of scale, but others are terrifying because they attach themselves to places that already feel like entrances into another world. The Lusca belongs to that darker kind of marine fear. Said to haunt the blue holes of the Bahamas, the creature is often imagined as a gigantic octopus, squid-like beast, or hybrid deep-water predator lurking in underwater cave systems and pulling victims into submerged darkness. That setting gives the legend an immediate psychological power that few open-sea monsters can match. The blue holes are not simply bodies of water. They are vertical shafts, flooded caverns, and submerged passageways descending into depths the eye cannot read, places where the boundary between sea and underworld seems dangerously thin. Once a monster is placed there, it does not feel like a random animal. It feels like something that belongs exactly to hidden depth. That is what makes the Lusca so effective as a legend. A sea serpent on the horizon is frightening because it is distant and large. A creature in a blue hole is frightening because it suggests ambush, confinement, and disappearance. It turns the ocean from a wide expanse into a trap. The old fear behind the story is not simply that something enormous exists below the water, but that certain places in the sea may function like mouths, openings through which a person can be taken downward and lost beyond recovery. That idea is extraordinarily resilient because the blue holes themselves are real and naturally unsettling. Their depth, darkness, and complex cave systems make them ideal containers for stories of beings that wait below the visible surface. Skeptics, of course, have pointed to more natural explanations. Dangerous currents, sudden drops, entanglement, sharks, barracudas, large octopuses in exaggerated form, and the general hazards of underwater cave environments all offer realistic reasons for disappearances, fear, and stories growing over time. But those explanations do not fully weaken the Lusca. In some ways, they strengthen its emotional structure, because they confirm that the places associated with the legend are genuinely dangerous even without a monster. Once a location is already capable of swallowing people through natural hazard, the leap to imagining a hidden predator becomes smaller than it might seem. Fear rarely needs a complete fiction. It often grows best from real danger reshaped by imagination into a more personal and predatory form. What keeps the Lusca alive is the perfect union of creature and environment. An enormous tentacled predator may or may not inhabit the Bahamian blue holes, but the legend endures because it gives shape to what those places already make people feel. They are openings into depth without clear end, dark spaces beneath beautiful water, natural features that seem calm above and unknowable below. The Lusca survives because it makes that hidden vertical terror visible. It tells us that beneath the bright tropical surface, there may be something waiting in the shafts and caves, not just a current or a stone wall, but a living hunger adapted to places where sunlight dies. And once the ocean is imagined that way, even paradise begins to feel like camouflage for something much older and darker. Number 2. The Leviathan. Some sea monsters survive because sailors claim to see them, but others survive because they were never meant to be only animals. The Leviathan is more disturbing than an ordinary ocean beast because it emerged from a world where the sea was not just dangerous, but sacred, chaotic, and morally charged. In biblical and near-biblical imagination, Leviathan was not simply a large creature hidden somewhere beneath the waves. It was a being bound up with cosmic fear, divine power, and the terrifying idea that the deep contained forces no human strength could challenge. That is what gave the Leviathan such enduring power. It was not merely a monster in the water, it was a symbol of the sea as something vast, untamable, and older than human order itself. That symbolic depth is what keeps the legend alive even now. A great many creatures in folklore are frightening because they threaten the body, but Leviathan threatens something larger. It represents the possibility that nature contains forms of power so immense that they seem almost theological, as though the ocean itself had a will, a body, and a rage. Across centuries, the image shifted. Sometimes Leviathan appeared as a colossal serpent, sometimes as a dragon-like beast, sometimes as an unimaginable sea creature of overwhelming scale. But the exact anatomy mattered less than the emotional truth beneath it. Human beings looked into the sea and felt that its size, violence, and secrecy needed a face, and Leviathan became one of the greatest faces ever given to that fear. Modern readers often encounter Leviathan as myth, scripture, literature, or metaphor, and from that perspective it can seem safely distant. But that distance is deceptive. The deeper reason the legend survives is that the ocean still produces the same psychological conditions that gave birth to it. A storm at sea still feels less like weather than judgment. A dark horizon still feels less like geography than exposure. The discovery of enormous marine creatures, the sound of unseen life beneath a ship, the knowledge of trenches and black depths beyond sunlight, all of these continue to nourish the same intuition that made Leviathan convincing in the first place. Even when belief changes, the emotional architecture remains intact. What makes Leviathan so haunting is that it stands at the point where sea monster, sacred terror, and cosmic scale converge. It is not frightening only because it might crush a vessel or devour a man. It is frightening because it suggests that the deep is not merely populated, but governed by forms of existence fundamentally beyond our proportion. In that sense, Leviathan is more than one legend among many. It is one of the greatest expressions of the oldest ocean fear of all, the fear that beneath the surface lies not only life, but power, and that human beings crossing the sea are never masters of that realm, only tolerated intruders above a darkness they cannot command. Number 1. The Kraken. Some sea legends are ancient, some are symbolic, and some are terrifying because they seem to gather every deep-water fear into one monstrous form. The Kraken stands at number 1 because no other ocean legend has so perfectly fused scale, violence, mystery, and endurance. Born from Scandinavian tradition and later magnified through sailors' tales, natural history confusion, literature, and maritime dread, the Kraken became the ultimate image of a creature rising from below to overwhelm the fragile human world above. It was imagined as colossal, tentacled, abyssal, and powerful enough to seize ships, drag men into the sea, and turn the open ocean into a battlefield between human survival and something vast enough to make the ship itself feel small. That is what gave the Kraken unmatched power. It did not merely inhabit the ocean, it made the ocean feel inhabited by intention. The Kraken's strength as a legend came from how well it fit the sea's most disturbing logic. The ocean does not only hide predators, it hides dimension. A storm can be seen, a reef can be charted, but a giant creature below the surface exists in a different category of fear because it combines invisibility with sudden force. The Kraken was terrifying not only when imagined attacking, but when imagined waiting. A calm patch of sea, a whirl in the water, a dark mass moving below a hull, these small signs became enough to trigger the idea that something immense might already be under the ship. That psychological mechanism matters because the best monsters are not frightening only when visible. They are frightening because they teach people how to reinterpret emptiness itself. Part of the Kraken's endurance also comes from its strange relationship with reality. As knowledge of giant squid and other deep-sea life expanded, the legend did not disappear, it adapted. The more humanity learned that the deep really did contain enormous tentacled animals once thought nearly mythical, the less foolish the old fear seemed. The Kraken may never have existed in the exact form of legend, but reality did something almost as powerful. It confirmed that the ocean was capable of hiding creatures bizarre and massive enough to justify generations of terror. In that sense, the Kraken survived because science did not erase the abyss. It gave the abyss new credibility. What makes the Kraken worthy of the #1 place is that it remains the purest monster the ocean ever produced in human imagination. It is at once beast, catastrophe, and embodiment of depth. It turns the sea from an environment into an adversary, from a root into a mouth, from a surface into a warning. More than any other legend on this list, the Kraken endures because it still feels plausible at the emotional level, even in an age of research vessels, deep-sea cameras, sonar, and marine biology. We know more than earlier centuries did, and yet the deep is still so enormous, so dark, and so little lived in by human beings that the old image remains powerful. Something vast below. Tentacles rising. The ship pulled down. Men disappearing into black water. The Kraken refused to die because the ocean has never stopped giving human beings a reason to believe that somewhere beneath the surface, enormity is still waiting.